So for the viewers that don't particularly know what your book is, if they're interested, could you just explain what your book has to entail and everything?
Sure, it's an overview of the history of conservation and environmental and the environment in Pennsylvania. It takes us from the period of of Native American arrival in what is now Pennsylvania, all the way up through the last couple of years. I really make an emphasis on talking about all sorts of different types of landscapes in Pennsylvania, cities, suburbs, rural areas, forests, urban parks, factories and farms. The goal is really to provide kind of a comprehensive overview of the environmental history of the state. And in particular, also to emphasize people, places, and policies, right? I want to focus on the places that really make Pennsylvania distinctive, the people who have advanced the conservation movement and the environmental movement, and the policies that have resulted from those movements as well, that get us to where we are today.
What was your motivation in actually exploring this type of works? And from where you started, I think, believe your book mentions it was the 19th century to up to today for your research. But what motivated you into actually doing this?
Sure. So the book really goes long before the 19th century. I mean, it does talk about the 19th century and through today, but I do
Mhm.
start before that as well. My first book was focused on Pittsburgh and the environmental and urban development of Pittsburgh as a city and as a region. I really got into being a historian by studying the relationships between different kinds of landscapes. I actually started my first project way back in college was on coal mining and on coal surface mining. And I sort of followed that all the way through to this coal surface mining company that was headquartered in Pittsburgh. And that kind of eventually became my first book, which was called Beyond Rust,
Mhm.
Metropolitan Pittsburgh and the Fate of Industrial America. And when I moved here to Shippensburg, as I was working on that book, I also really got involved in the environmental movement here in Pennsylvania, and in thinking about the history of the environmental movement in Pennsylvania. For folks who are from Pennsylvania, I think that they often don't realize what they have around them. Pennsylvania has millions of acres of state, of state lands, of public lands. And that's really unique. I'm from Ohio, which is lovely, don't get me wrong. But the kinds of public lands that we have here in Pennsylvania, I mean, I can look out one window of DHC and see the Michoud State Forest, where the Appalachian Trail goes through. And I can look out another window and I can see the Tuscarora State Forest. There's nothing like that in Ohio, where I'm from. And so I got involved in kind of thinking about how did we get to this, to the kind of public lands, the kind of environment that we have here in Pennsylvania today, and got involved with some organizations, particularly two groups, one called the South Mountain Partnership, which is a partnership between universities, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and nonprofit and for-profit businesses here in the South Central Pennsylvania, really kind of focused on how do we use the landscape of South Mountain to create a better future for everyone. And that led me to the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project, which is a statewide nonprofit that is focusing on kind of using the history of conservation in Pennsylvania to help make better public policies for today. So kind of how do we look at the past and the experiences of the past in order to shape a better future for all of us going forward? And that led to me doing the research that became this book.
Nice. Speaking of your research in different coal areas, I read in another interview that your father had a background in being a coal miner. Did that impact your actual
Of course.
research? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. My family, my father was a coal miner and a farmer. He actually he has his bachelor's degree. This isn't like some hill in backwater in Kentucky. My dad had his bachelor's degree from Ohio State, but he really wanted to go into farming. He had been raised on a dairy farm. And in the 1970s in Southern Ohio, my dad, the way for him to make enough money to be able to become a farmer in his own right was to go into the coal mine. And he thought that he'd work for a few years in the coal mine, and that would put together enough money to kind of go into business with his brother and have a self-sufficient farm. But the late 1970s were kind of the time of, Willie Nelson and Farm Aid. The bottom fell out of agriculture. And so he spent 35 years working in a swing shift in the coal mine. And by the time he retired, when I was in graduate school, he and his brother had put together what had been 5 different family farms, which kind of were no longer self-sufficient anymore, right? And so absolutely, that experience of growing up with that kind of very hands-on with the environment, but in a way that's different than hiking or recreational use, like that kind of real working landscape that I grew up in, that most definitely sort of shaped the way that I have become a historian and view the natural environment. And I just mentioned one of the key ways, and that is that I really look at the natural world as a working landscape, right? I don't see nature as being something that is kind of fundamentally separate from human beings. It's instead something that the hand of humans is kind of always involved with the natural world. They fit together, sometimes in ways that you don't even realize, and so that notion of working landscapes in which human culture and natural processes sort of combine to create, the landscapes that are all around us, that really became a central idea of the book itself, and kind of exploring and explaining how do we tell the story of Pennsylvania, in which humans in the natural environment, humans have been shaping the natural environment and been being shaped by the natural environment, really for thousands of years, to give us the state that we have today.
Can you just elaborate what the title of Cradle of Conservation means?
Sure.
Like, what can you just elaborate what that really means
Sure.
to?
So it actually comes. So I mentioned that one of the organizations that I got involved with, I moved to Shippensburg here to start working at the university in 2006.
Hmm.
And a couple of years later, really within 2 years, I got involved with this organization called the South Mountain Partnership. And the South Mountain area is kind of particularly interesting in the state because it's so close to Harrisburg and kind of the political elites of Harrisburg, but it's also rural, right? And so a lot of the policy, or a lot of the ideas that became public policies that were then kind of spread throughout the rest of the state really started here in southern Pennsylvania. You're probably familiar with what's now Penn State Mont Alto, right? Penn State Mont Alto started out as the Pennsylvania Forestry Academy. It was the second forestry academy in the United States. Right? Yale has the only forestry academy that's older than Pennsylvania does. And I kind of, with the work that I did with the South Mountain Partnership and kind of thinking about the origins of conservation here in Pennsylvania, we really kind of looked to the South Mountain region as this cradle of conservation, as this origin story for what would become the conservation movement. And the beginning of the book, I actually kind of play on that a little bit, and I tell the story of Ralph Brock. Ralph Brock was the first trained African-American forester in the world. He was from Westchester, and he was trained with the very first class of foresters at what's now Penn State Mont Alto at the Pennsylvania Forestry Academy. And he was particularly well known for his skills as a nurseryman, right? With seedlings, with kind of growing plants from seeds. And I actually start the book with him kind of giving this talk on this nursery, hence the cradle, right, at the Pennsylvania Forestry Academy. Now that gets me to another kind of key issue. In addition to working landscapes, another key issue of the book is to get past this notion that somehow environmental history is only about rural areas and is only about white people or a particular kind of white people that have the wealth and the political influence to be able to kind of make policy. Ralph Brock again was among the very first foresters here in Pennsylvania, and he was an African American, right? I mean, his is this really important story of the way in which race also shapes the environments, the environments of Pennsylvania and the environmental history that we have. His is a problematic story. He is actually, despite his real skills and kind of recognized abilities, he's essentially hounded out of Pennsylvania because of the color of his skin. Other foresters, there's this kind of series of letters in which we find out that other foresters that he worked with wouldn't take, basically wouldn't respect him, wouldn't take orders from him because they were white and he was black. And you see kind of the struggle over who gets to have a healthy environment, who gets to have access to good, healthy foods and clean air and clean water. That struggle over, over the environment is at the core of the civil rights struggle. It's at the core of the civil rights struggle for Native peoples. It's the core of the civil rights struggle for people of different color, of different races and ethnicities. And of course, that carries us all the way through to today, right? I mean, one of the biggest civil rights kind of battles in Pennsylvania was over swimming pools, right? Who got to swim in public swimming pools? And of course, that's an environmental story, right? That's a story about public health and the environment. And that carries us all the way through to today, to the environmental justice issues, of today. Who public policies may seem to be colorblind, but when you have certain groups of people who have access to healthier, cleaner environments, it's hard to separate race, class, and gender issues from issues of environmental access. And this story this book places those stories front and center.
Does your book mention the impacts of climate change throughout, like specifically in like
It
Pennsylvania,
does.
or does it touch up on
It
it?
does. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. That's one of the key issues that I bring up at the end, right? I mean, that's one of the that's one of the key struggles that we have. And in fact, I connect that both to working landscapes, right? To the notion that many of the things that we associate with Pennsylvania, like our state tree, the hemlock, right?
Mhm.
There are more and more areas where our state tree is no longer going to be able to grow because of global climate change, right? We know that certain kinds of crops, dairying, like dairy cows are going to produce less milk in a warmer environment, right? So, more flooding and more severe weather. Changes in average mean temperatures, in average temperatures across the state. The development of hotter and hotter landscapes, particularly again in those areas, oftentimes in urban areas, where you have concrete and asphalt that tend to trap heat. We've already seen many more deaths than there would otherwise be from increasing heat, right? Not to mention again flooding and other types of kind of quote unquote natural disasters, but really disasters that are natural processes that are being changed because of climate change, right? And so I absolutely do. I also connect the story of climate change and the policy kind of battle over climate change to issues of energy production. Pennsylvania has been an energy producer, kind of first with wood, then with coal and oil, natural gas, nuclear, wind and solar, and kind of now back to natural gas with the technological revolution of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Pennsylvania is kind of ground zero for thinking about what should the energy future of the United States be within that context of global climate change. And that brings me to kind of that third key element of the book, and that is policies, right? if Pennsylvania was the cradle of conservation, there are a lot of ways in which other parts of the United States have kind of surpassed Pennsylvania in more recent environmental policies, right? And I actually hold up kind of New York State as this as this kind of parallel to Pennsylvania, but one that for a variety of reasons has gone in a different direction more recently. Because of environmental, a whole host of reasons. You can read the book, right? But New York State has banned hydraulic fracturing. I mean, there is plenty of Marcellus and Utica shale available, open for extraction in New York, in Western New York State. And there are certainly plenty of New Yorkers who would like to be able to benefit from the economic benefits of fracking. But because of the political dynamics of New York State has banned fracking in a way that you've seen, for example, in the current presidential election. Kamala Harris has, Donald Trump's an entirely different story, of course, but even Kamala Harris has kind of backed off sort of the talk of certainly of banning fracking because of the political influence and the economic power, of those who benefit from that technology and that industry.
Mm-hmm. When readers pick up the book, besides all the political policies and the social issues and the climate issues, also economic one, what is the key takeaway that you hope that readers can actually get from this book? If it is going to be those items, what do you hope that they actually
Sure.
understand and
Yeah.
learn from that?
That's a great question, and I'll actually direct that back to kind of where we started this conversation, and that is particularly for those people who have kind of lived in Pennsylvania all their lives, and just kind of think of what we have here in the state as normal, right? Kind of a normal public lands, right? Or B, we're kind of raised within a political context of political polarization around environmental issues, right? I really hope this book will be an opportunity to think about what is it that makes Pennsylvania special, right? What is it in the past that our ancestors, who had just as many political differences as we do, right? Who had just as much need to balance economic benefit and environmental and public health as we do today, somehow managed to find political compromises and move the state to a place where we have the enormous environmental amenities that we have today, right? So I hope that this book is a book about hope, because if our ancestors could somehow find a way to get past their differences, to find a way to treasure and to value and to protect those things that we think are most important about kind of the natural legacy that we have here in Pennsylvania, then I think that gives us hope for our generation and the generations to come to be able to do the same thing, even though sometimes it doesn't seem like it will be. And I kind of end the book in talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Which was an awful, terrible, very bad, no good time, right? But I'm on the board of the Cumberland Valley Rail Trail Council, which goes right through campus here, and we have data. We measure trail usage, and our trail usage, in 2020, 2021, and through to today, has just enormously shot up. The rail trail, for those of us who were living in Shippensburg during the pandemic, the Cumberland Valley Rail Trail became like the new town's center, right? Where people who may have never been on the trail before could get out and really appreciate, in a safe way, the legacy of the work that folks have done to preserve our natural landscapes. And I hope that if COVID kind of did something good, it allowed more people to rediscover the world kind of out there nearby, right? And this landscape that if we kind of put our phones down, right? If we put our, if we set aside our kind of anxieties or our frustrations and look at the world around us, there's a lot of beauty out there, and it's worth fighting for. It's worth protecting. And I think that, frankly, regardless of your sort of political motivations, there is some common ground in that identity of Pennsylvania as the cradle of conservation, as this nature's commonwealth that we can rally around to do good things together. I mean, I'm excited to do the book launch. It's nice to, I'm looking forward to being able to do it here in Ship and to bring folks together and talk about, again, talk about the beautiful Pennsylvania that we all have to share, and think about what can we celebrate, what do we have to be concerned about, and how can we come together to do what's right. So I'm looking forward to it.